Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we revisit Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, inspired by a listener who wanted us to give an update and say, hey, what's changed since this book came out in 2018? So we talk about the three great untruths that are pointed out in that book, and we consider whether we've moved past each of those. And then we talk a little bit about the challenge of being Christians in a world that is predisposed to hostility. Thinking Out Loud is a listener-supported podcast. We are also a ministry. So if you like what we do, if you find value in it, and you want to support us financially, you can do that by going to our website, www.toltogether.com, and then just click the donate page. Or you can also spread the word. Tell people about us. Tell people you like us. Maybe even write a review. Some of you have already done that. Thank you so much. It really does help. You can also book us as speakers, and we can come speak to your gatherings, to your groups, to your churches. We'd love to meet you, talk to you face to face. You can also join TOL Connect, which is the place where you can continue the discussion and you can take Nathan and I to task. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? Thanks again.
Toward the end of last year, I was speaking at a church in Pennsylvania, and a lady asked me, "Do you think that we could revisit the book from Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling of the American Mind?" Because we had done an episode on that a long time back. The book came out in 2018. I don't know if it was that long ago that we did it, but have things changed? And so today is a bit of a refresher course on what that book is and what has changed in the last 7 years since it came out. And it really 2025 really does feel like a very different world than 2018, if I'm honest here, Cameron. And so, looking forward to having a conversation about an update, or were they prophetically right? Is it a new world? What are those features and the core arguments of that
Mhm.
book? And have they aged well? Is the question before us.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think let's start with the three main theses of the book. Because part of what makes that book helpful is how clearly, the way it's organized. I think that's
Mhm.
a kind of something that you could use to recommend a lot of Haidt's work. And they've since, of course, they've gone and written another book, both him and Greg Lukianoff, which I have not read. So
They've
that
updated
I'm
themselves.
they've updated themselves. I'm still playing catch up. But let's start with those three great untruths of the book. So, and I don't know if I'll get the order correct, but the first, I think I've got the order right. The first is whatever hurts me makes me weaker. Is that
What
I think that's the way.
it's whatever doesn't kill you makes you weaker.
Whatever doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Yes. So the precise opposite of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So there's that one. And then the second one would be feelings are a reliable
Trust
guide to reality. Trust your feelings. So trust your feelings is the second one. And then the third one is life is a battle between good and bad people. So life
okay.
is a battle between good and evil people. What's interesting was when that book came out in 2018, this was written largely about university students. And most of their observations were restricted to university campuses and some of the incidents that were taking place there. But you and I both, when we read it, I think our response was a little bit like, okay, this is way more expansive than university students, though. We are really talking about the general American populace if we're thinking in these terms.
Mhm.
So, what has changed since then? Let me throw in a few observations. This is really thinking out loud in the sense that I don't have any premeditated remarks here at all. And we'll
Trust your feelings,
see.
Cameron.
Yes, I'll just trust my feelings. So, how far have we come there? So, regarding that first one, let's just take. I'm just gonna make a few statements about each of these three untruths. So, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. I don't think we've moved much past that statement. I think we are seeing now. Remember, some of the evidence that they draw in there. They don't just pull in statistical evidence. They look at the way concepts have shifted and have changed. And one of the really important ones that they examine is trauma, the sense of trauma. In the past, trauma used to be attached to very severe situations. So soldiers returning from war who had experienced warfare, people who had experienced rape, torture, these kinds of really kind of life-altering, paradigm-shifting events, right? But this gentleman, I can't remember the name of the scholar they're citing, but this is cited in the book. They talk about how that concept moved downward and outward. Downward in the sense that it got less severe to encompass emotional states of being, emotional violence, and so it became more subjective. So in other words, trauma wasn't just tied to
Well,
horrendous concrete circumstances, and then it got expanded out further as well to include more territory. So it got a little bit more nebulous. That's something that they observe in the book. That I mean, it sounds like you wanna make some comments there too,
well,
Nathan.
so you can grade yourself, a listener, into what category you fall into, whether or not you know the little schoolyard rhyme, "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me."
Yeah.
That was a common refrain of, like, "I don't really care what you say about me. Like, if you throw a rock or a stick at me, like, that'll hurt, but the words don't hurt." So, I mean, I don't know if you ran if that was, like, 3rd grade
Sure,
rhymes or anything
absolutely.
like that, but, definitely, where I lived, that was an idea that, like, trauma had blood associated with it, and the rest of it was like, "Yeah, water off a duck's back." This is the switch that they're pointing to here of "Sticks and stones will break my bones, and words will permanently scar me, and I need therapy," is the
Yeah, so one of the
new version of that.
yeah, if we take 2 examples, I mean, I gave a couple. So, trauma in the older instance would include, yeah, torture, warfare, sexual abuse, these kinds of very severe actions. Now, that list would be upgraded to include, divorce and, perhaps rejection from a program you'd applied to, failure in school, things like that, which are serious, obviously can cause some emotional pain, but are also part of regular life. These
Well,
are these
so
are instances and they're not good, but we all have to deal
oh, no,
with
they're horrible.
adversity and they're horrible, but we deal
They're
with
hor just
adversity and pain on a normal basis. And so turning those so basically it's kind of a novel development that we've begun to look at any kind of emotional distress as something that actively harms you. And I mean, in the past, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but in the past, it was seen not only does this not necessarily harm you, it actually can toughen you up and you can grow. It can make you stronger. So, real quickly, have we moved past that? In a word,
no.
I would say no. There are pushbacks against it now in certain sectors of the culture. You can see this. One place I see this, Nathan, often is in the fitness world because common denominator there is you've got to overcome physical discomfort if you want to grow healthier, and you also have to push against your feelings. If you're driven only by your moods and your feelings, you won't eat well, you won't exercise well, and to a certain extent, I think a trend like the cold plunge. I mean, people talk a lot about it's, gives you an endorphin rush. It helps you, it aids in muscle recovery. No, but what it really does also is it gives you tremendous sense of control. It gives you kind of a mental reset because if you climb into very cold water and you stay there and you control your breathing, you're subjecting your body to some temporary pain, but you're also asserting control. So there are some pushes against it there, but I would say overall, still, if we look at the way children are being raised, being protected, the way we respond to any kind of emotional distress or serious disagreement, how we tend to immediately be wounded and hurt sometimes. I would say I don't think we've moved past the first great untruth.
Mhm.
I'll pause there.
So, let me chime in here to read a section from the book. This book actually started off as an article, and
The Atlantic,
in
right? Yeah.
in the Atlantic, yeah, and the title they were originally going for was "Arguing Toward Misery: How Campuses Teach Cognitive Distortions." And the article in that article, we argued that many parents, K-12 teachers, professors, and university administrators had unknowingly tea had been unknowingly teaching a generation of students to engage in mental habits commonly seen in people who suffer from anxiety and depression. We suggested that
Mm.
students were beginning to react to words, books, and visiting speakers with fear and anger because they had been taught to exaggerate danger, use dichotomous or binary thinking, amplify their first emotional responses, and engage in a number of other cognitive distortions, which is what the book is about. And so that fits in there of saying what um is any discomfort trauma? And well, another thing that's happened is I think Abigail Schreier's book Bad Therapy kind of caught fire there for a little bit, kind of made the rounds. People were looking at saying, wait a second, it can't be true that this subset of students, the vast majority of them have legitimate mental health crises. It can't be true that
Mhm.
you need professional counseling when your household pet dies. Um, so I think there's been a little bit of a like, wait a second, are we overdoing it here? Um, and again, we're speaking in general terms here, not specific instances. But so I think I agree with you. We haven't moved past it, but people are starting to point out, hang on a second, if this is true, this doesn't necessarily match up with the world that we in the way that we want it to be.
Well, think about this. So here's something that happened personally to me. So this is anecdotal, but I think it is representative. So one day, my son came home and he was reciting a bunch of different safety procedures to me. I mean, throughout the entire day. And so eventually I just said, "You know, son, since you've come home, you've talked to me about the hard lockdown that you did, which is preparation for an active shooter that schools do. Remember, there was a high school right up the street from me here that did experience an active shooter, sadly, not too long ago. But they do a lot of hard lockdown drills. So my son was running through the words that were blaring on the speaker, the quality of the alarm. He's very interested in the sound. And then he was talking to me about the safety procedures on the bus and going through those in great detail, reciting those to me. And then he was talking to me about the fire evacuation and what would happen in that case. And eventually I said to him, "Dylan, I'm grateful that we have safety procedures in place, but I don't like the way you are being forced to think about this all day long throughout your day." And I just said, "It just so happens, son, that there's a strange irony." I had to talk a little bit about what meant by irony because my son's 8. But I said, "There's a strange irony where if you so concentrate on safety and security, you actually end up becoming much, much more afraid." And it struck me how much of his life in the institution, the major institution that he's in right now, school, is structured around safety procedures. And I think that, I mean, the fact that that's just part of his mental scenery, when I can say with full confidence, when I was growing up, we had the occasional tornado drill and something like that, but it didn't hold the kind of fixation and fascination that it does for my son that I see, because it wasn't a huge part of my mental scenery, and it wasn't treated as so gravely serious. Now, I know some people will already be probably ready to push back and say, "Hey, whoa, 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 it's a dangerous world out there. We need to these procedures are important, and it's good that your son is interested in safety and all that." Well, I'm not sure it is, actually. And I think, I mean, I want him to be cautious. I want him to be prudent. But I also want him to be able to run out there and be carefree and happy, and yeah, he might fall and break his arm, and that's okay. I think he should be allowed to fall and break his arm. So, it's the whole structure of our I just say that to point out that the world is structured very, very tightly around safety these days, particularly for young people. There are understandable reasons for that, but I'm not convinced it's all good. So have we gotten so all that to say, belaboring the point, I don't think we're past this one yet. I don't think we're past what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. I don't think
Well,
we're past that.
well, let's just expand that quickly before we move on to the next one. Is to say that in the initial read, Cameron, you'd said of this book, wait a second, these issues are way bigger than the college campus. And so
Mm,
the reason that people would want to push back on you on those statements is because the sky is falling, be prepared for any possible situation isn't taught just at schools. That is called the news cycle. And you look at the rise of um, gun ownership to motivations and
mhm.
reasons behind that, all sorts of like
Yeah.
we live in a culture that can only um, only fantasize about destructive problems in the future and then works to prepare for them. And so that's not a third grader situation. That's an entire cultural pastime right now. So, look at man, we don't have to go there. But anyway, I'd say we haven't passed it, we've broadened it, and we need to recognize that it is kind of the fundamental core tenet of how most of us are subconsciously operating these days. Um, Avoid all difficulty at all points, if possible.
What about trusting our feelings? Are we getting
I
any better on that one as a culture?
No. So here's the thing: we're getting better at rationalizing our feelings.
Oh, that's an
We're
interesting distinction. Okay. Say that. I think you need to say that again.
so
We're
so
not
I think
getting
we're getting
better at, yeah.
you'll hear things more like do your own research in the sense of like here's how I feel about it, and my feelings are justified because of this. So it's not so much this is where actually Jonathan Haidt's much earlier book, The Righteous Mind, is helpful when he makes the distinctions. Well, and Daniel Kahneman, the thinking fast and slow guy, Jonathan Haidt on this idea of your mind being like the rider and the elephant is the subconscious part that goes along, and the rider is riding on
Mhm.
the elephant and makes big, clear analytical decisions. But by and large, most of the movement of our mind happens in the subconscious formation and training of the elephant. And so, in that sense, he says that by and large, when the elephant jumps back, and then you evaluate the reason for the flinching, not, "Oh, there's a snake, I need to step back." And so the order of our rationalization of our concepts, I think we are at an all-time high of thinking that we're making rational, fact-based decisions, while really what he argues is that a lot of what we're doing is post hoc justification of our emotional responses. So I think we're we have access to more information, which gives us more data points to validate the thing that we've already felt and decided is true.
So I'm going to bring in a concept that I think is really helpful here for illuminating what you're talking about, Nathan, and that is emotionalism. Now, this word gets sometimes given a superficial kind of description, but I'm using it as Alistair McIntyre uses it in After Virtue. He used it in he's used it in some of his other books as well. But what he's doing there is actually very important, and bear in mind, After Virtue was written in 1981. So this was way ahead of the curve on a lot of these issues, but he pointed out what he means by emotionalism is disguising personal preference in the language of morality or using ethical language to disguise personal preference. So one way where you can see this very clearly in our culture is basically in the realm of sexual ethics. So culturally speaking, there is a very clear sense of orthodoxy when it comes to your self-expression, when it comes to identity, and when it comes to sexuality. These are all very sacred categories for us right now. We've talked about this before on the podcast. So if you follow the cultural zeitgeist, it's going I mean, basically the line is you should be free to express yourself sexually however you want, because after all, not only is that something that's important to you, it's not just something you like. It's who you are on the inside. That's how you are defined. This is also, for instance, if we take a step back, this may sound like I'm taking us off subject. I'm not. I promise you. This is firmly in the my feelings. I can trust my feelings category. But this is why in many of those, if you're involved in any of those heated discussions or debates, whether it's with friends or family members regarding sexuality, and by the way, this encompasses a whole lot more than just somebody who might self-identify as gay or trans. This could also be a growing problem, for instance, in our churches, are couples who are living together and not married, and who belong to a church that has a theologically has a traditional sexual ethic, which would restrict sex for the marriage bed. And because I've talked to a number of friends who are ministers who have said, yeah, one of the toughest parts of my job actually, there are a lot of really important cultural issues that are very, some of them are a little bit more exotic than others, but this is one that I deal with on a regular basis. How do I confront my, congregants who are doing this, who basically would say, well, grow up. I mean, haven't you joined the 21st century? I mean, think times have changed. Look at where we are. Well, see, those are trust your feelings arguments. Now, you might be able to use some moral language. You can use some political language, and it's all going to fit in with the zeitgeist. But if the issue under discussion here is this right or is this wrong? Or for instance, is homosexuality right? Or is it homosexuality condemned as a practice by the church? Or is it, should you be defined by your sexual orientation rather than being defined as a child of God? So these are very important theological and philosophical questions, but you can find all sorts of cultural language to kind of justify your decisions that are actually more just emotional arguments
Mhm.
that have really nothing to do with making an actual argument. Love is love. Believe it or not, love is not an argument. You got to
Love
talk
is what
about
makes a
what you actually
Subaru a
mean.
Subaru.
Yeah, right. I mean, you got to move beyond that and explain,
Yeah.
yes, but let's define love. And people get really angry and cagey about that. Well, if you have to have me define love, then you must be inhumane. Again, not an argument.
Oh,
So,
well, so hang on. Hang
yeah.
on. Definitions are only important if you want to have community.
Hmm.
So we don't actually have to agree on words if we don't intend to speak to each other or live together. But if you do intend to have community, then words
Hmm.
do and definitions do suddenly matter. And so I think the moral language that's added to our feelings is couched in terms of autonomy, freedom, economics. Um, and so when you get into those categories being seen as moral rather than justifications of feelings, then the sky is kind of the limit on how you want to do and define anything. So yeah, we haven't
It's
gotten any
well
better at
said.
this one. But I think
No.
also some of this, Cameron, is not new. And some of this
No.
won't change because it's a part of the human condition. That's why Alistair McIntyre 44 years ago can write stuff that you're like, "Oh, yeah,
Right.
pretty much."
Precisely. Yeah.
So, there is
Well,
nothing new under the sun there.
no, and also, I mean, the language, personal preference is written again. I talked about how our lives are structured around safety these days. Well, our lives are structured around personal preference as well, aren't they? I mean, all of our devices, everything about modern comfort and convenience has to do with, well, is this working for me? I mean, that's a big question in our culture. Now, I'm I'm in favor of a lot of these conveniences. I think they're great. I'm excited about them. But of course, they're not ethically neutral. This is where, Nathan and I always spoil everybody's fun. Yeah, I'm grateful for modern dentistry, but I'm grateful for the aspirin in my cabinet, but it does change the way we think. So if a basic question for many of us is this working for me? You begin to have people ask it of Christianity. Well, is Christianity working for me? Well, now we're making some category mistakes because Christianity or any other worldview or religion, but it's either true or it isn't. It either honors reality or it doesn't. And if we're looking at it in a different way, then we're doing something else. We're playing around with stuff. This is what a lot of people do this with different pagan practices these days. By the way, whether it's tarot cards or healing crystals or burning sage, whatever it is. This is why I think Tara Isabella Burton's phrase, the religiously remixed, is really helpful here. And how we'll take these different practices, we'll mix and match them. But again, the operating question is this working for me? Is this doing something for me? And the sad irony here is that just as an over focus on safety leads to fear, emotionalism, it's supposed to the ostensible, reward of emotionalism is that it gives you what you want. You get your personal preference. But in the end, human beings are made for something more than their own wants and wishes. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says God has set eternity in our hearts. So I mean, we have this eternal longing and these eternal yearnings and appetites. And if we are driven only by personal preference, we're going to find ourselves restless and perpetually unfulfilled and filled with also just, yeah, restlessness and terrible anxiety, which is what we see. And we just
Mhm.
keep thinking, well, if I just get more of what I want, and it just keeps making it Worse. We haven't gotten better at
Almost,
this one.
yeah, the trick is that almost everybody knows this and would affirm it
Yeah.
outright. So it yeah, that I think is a challenge for all of us to be self-reflective here, and if you're parenting with your children or in church or whatever, of saying like, "Wait a second, um, I know you're feeling this right now," because there are times it's easy seeing your children like, um,
Oh,
we
yeah.
can say, I recognize that you feel this, but that is not true." That's a weird statement to say in America in the 21st century.
It
Or
is.
where was that someplace?
Some people get mad at you for that. Yeah.
Well, somebody's like, "Oh, I'm offended." And the guy said, I appreciate that you're offended, but that doesn't mean you're right."
Well, let's go back to the book for a second here. A big part of what was fueling so many of these controversies on university campuses were just that students didn't want to deal with people who had opposing views.
Oh, okay. So I have a lot to say on this.
Yeah.
If you want the update on this, and yeah, so I was looking for a transition. I have actually a chart here that I wanted to look at. Is that here's one of the things that I think has changed in these categories is that when they wrote this in 2018, there was a little bit of there's still a sense of a liberal conservative divide on this, particularly when we get into the third one about it's life is a battle between good and evil people. In
Yep.
And I've seen the right the feel is that the right has caught up in the victimization and the trusting of the feeling side on this. Um, Back in 2017, 58% of college students said it is important to be part of a campus community where I am not exposed to intolerant or offensive ideas. So that's a majority. The
2017. Yeah.
statement was endorsed by 63% of very liberal students. So part of the definition or one of the stereotypes of the more liberal side, and they have a chart here showing which conservative and liberal speakers are canceled per year across from
Yep.
2000 to 2017 in the book.
Hmm.
And so I think there has been a sense in which this has been one of the kind of conservative talking points about the snowflakes out there, the people who can't handle engaging with a different idea. Um, if you're going to be making that argument, it's important that that's not your reason for homeschooling your kids. By the way, um,
Hmm.
because also, at that same time that they did this, and I think this is what you and I were seeing, it said, but that view is not confined to the left. Almost half of very conservative students, 45%. So 45% of very conservative students in 2017 endorsed the same statement that it was important to be part of the campus community where I am not exposed to intolerant or offensive ideas. And so I think if I would say
Interesting.
that there's a change that's happening here, it's that um, there isn't as distinct of a liberal conservative dichotomy here as perhaps there was 8 years ago at the time of
Wow.
that survey. I would love to see some updated data on that. To
Well,
me, that's just an anecdotal Nathan running around the world and reading the news and looking and listening to the way and the tone in which people are speaking about things. I would say that we don't have the politically distinguished dichotomy between liberal and conservative here to the same degree, and it might even be equal. I'm not sure.
yeah, that's interesting. I
Food
mean,
for thought.
two examples spring to mind here. So the classic one that was used by I think Haidt and Lukianoff talk about it in the book was Charles Murray, who had written he wrote a book a number of years ago called The Bell Curve. Which has since come under it's a very controversial book, but he's a sociologist and a very celebrated one in his field, continues to be an extremely active intellectual, but he was invited to be a guest lecturer at Middlebury College by a politically progressive professor, but this professor, you know, she had some noble aims. She wanted viewpoint diversity, and she thought, "This is a university campus, so I'm gonna bring a guy who, he and I are staunchly opposed on many of these issues, but I respect him as a scholar, so I wanna bring him in here." And it turned violent. There were protests. She actually was injured shielding him from students.
Trying to get into a
So
car after the event, yeah, or something.
correct. So that was it's a very ugly instance. But now and then I bring that up. I think a lot of, conservatives would vigorously nod their heads, say, "Yes, that's right. See, that's what happens." Yeah, but so another example I have, this one's a little bit less dramatic, but I still think it illustrates Nathan's point. a gentleman I follow. I'm not going to name him. He's a very gifted apologist himself. He's at an Ivy League. Well, you'll be able to put together which university he's at. He's at Princeton because of the professor I'm going to mention. But he posted a selfie of him with Peter Singer, and the vitriol on Facebook was just amazing. People say, "Oh, how could you pose with that despicable, nasty murderer?" I mean, on and on and on. Now, on the one hand, I suppose we could make some allowances for that because, I mean, after all, I mean, Peter Singer is kind of the poster child for some of these extremely hard-lining, utilitarian, ethical viewpoints, and has made
Oh
some
yeah,
very
grade A ethical
staunch.
goober.
Correct. But this gentleman who posed with him, who was a Christian, just said, "Yes, but I do respect him as a scholar and as an interlocutor, and he's a very gracious man in person, and I think we need basically, we need viewpoint diversity. We need to be people." I mean, so I'm here to say, I believe Peter Singer's ideas are incredibly destructive. I also think they're worth hearing, especially in a university setting, especially with some of our thinking people. And so many people who were very politically conservative, most of them Christian, were saying this gentleman should be screened out and his books should not be read. Possibly they should be destroyed. That's the same. That's not dissimilar from what happened with Charles Murray, albeit without physical violence, for which I'm grateful. But
What
I'm just trying to illustrate Nathan's point here a little bit.
what we're missing, Cameron, is, and let's be clear, we have now moved into point 3 of the book, which is that
Yes.
life is a battle between good and evil people. And
Let's
I
look at the
think,
political rhetoric right now.
but let's look at the political rhetoric right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is one of the handy things about that framework is that it doesn't require discernment.
Yeah.
So I don't actually have to do the hard work of thinking about what are if you think that there's a continuum within a set of ideas that need to be engaged, then you have to do the hard work of being able to say, what is this person saying that's helpful, and what should be
Mhm.
rejected, and what am I? So I like your line. Discernment is saying being able to say this, not this. So what are the elements here? Why do I disagree with that? What's the real heart of the matter? Why is this a dangerous idea? And if you can get into that, then you can be glad when other people that you disagree with actually vent and voice their opinion, because then you can make an informed decision about whether or not you trust or support that person and their ideas. You know something. What I think social media does, and a lot of the very quick hot take stuff, is it immediately divides people into camps, and then you can dislike the person just because of the camp they're in. You don't actually
Mhm.
have to engage with their ideas. And so that is alive and well and has only been intensified, I think, in these days. To the degree that I had shared the analogy with you, Cameron, and maybe it doesn't make as much sense for those of you who have never hiked down the ridge of a mountain. But if you're walking down a street in a valley or a flat place in the country, and you look to your left and you look to your right, you can see how, and say you can see houses on both sides. One of the unique features is that the people living in those houses can see across the street and see each other. And so even if you live on the different side of the road, you can at least see the other side of the road. What it feels like to me today, if you can kind of crack out of the bubble of your digital algorithm and look at other media news sources or things that you disagree with, it feels more like walking down a ridge line where you're looking down two sides of the mountain at groups of people that can't see or understand each other. And so we very much live in, it's a battle between good and evil people, but the degree of communication and understanding across those lines seems to be at an all-time low to me. So I think by and large the category is still there. It's just more ossified than it has been in the past. And I see that as a loss.
Yes. So, I guess what we're trying to say here is this book is of continuing relevance. Yeah, that last point, life is a battle between good and evil people, takes discernment off the table. It's dangerous in the sense that it takes away restraint as well. This is something that Haidt and Lukianoff point out. They say it's one thing if you're working against people who are misguided and you're aiming at persuasion. It's something else entirely if you're fighting against evil people, because then the ends justify the means. And notice we as Christians right now in the West, I think, are in a position to appreciate this on a little bit more of a deep and visceral level, frankly, because we find ourselves in the unusual position of kind of being the bad guys these days. I think Stephen McAlpine's way of looking at this, we've talked about him before on the podcast, Nathan, is helpful. How suddenly he references the movie Falling Down with Michael Douglas, where Michael Douglas is just a man. It's a movie where a man comes apart in slow motion. Really uplifting, let me tell you. But by the end of it, the cops are have their guns trained on him, and they're trying to get him to surrender. And he has this really kind of heartbreaking line where he says, "Wait, you mean I'm the bad guy?" And he says basically that's a lot of Christians feel that way right now. And this is where you see those good versus evil tactics, because in the past, when we had a little bit, when cooler heads were prevailing culturally, you could have people who could say, "I think you as a Christian are deeply misguided. I think you're really wrong about this. I think some of these positions are immoral," but they wouldn't, maybe even immoral, but they wouldn't necessarily say you're a horrible person. But now, plenty of people are willing to make that argument, and they are willing to say, no, you're a heinous individual, and you should be stopped. Your religious rights, if they infringe in the public sector in any way, should be limited. And sadly, Nathan, this isn't always the case, but plenty of Christians are buying into the rhetoric of retribution. I mean, that was
Mm,
explicitly used this last campaign. You know, if you elect me, you'll have retribution. You can drink liberal tears and so on and so forth. I mean,
well,
and again,
hang on a second. Let's
this is
be very clear
everybody,
one
of
second.
course.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and we're speaking broadly here, but here's what I want you to hear us saying. I believe that good and evil are real and are real categories. That's there. And as Christians, we
certainly.
should. And
Absolutely.
Jesus
Yeah.
expects us to be able to discern between the two, and says a lot about that. So we are not at all acting as if the categories of good and evil don't exist. I think where we have to be extremely careful, if you're listening to this as a Christian, is that you're not using evil tactics to justify your goodness, or that you're using the weapons of the world to fight the evil in the world that you see. There's that. Also, one of the you remember way back, Cameron. Wow, how long ago was it? 2016, maybe? You and I did a podcast in Florida at a large event on, political differences,
Sure.
and I think I said in that, discussion, we need to be very, very careful about not demonizing other people, because the Bible does not contain a redemptive arc for the demonic.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense in which if you're demonizing as permanently evil another group of people and have no concept of the fact that the mission that you have here as a Christian is for redemption and reconciliation and for repentance and renewal, then you're going to forfeit what it is that you're supposed to be doing in light of that. And so there are people who you disagree with, but they are people. They aren't demons. And we have to keep that very, very clear in our minds, or else we don't actually have an ethical framework to. So, I mean, how do you treat a demon in the New Testament? You cast it out, you abolish it, you try to annihilate it, you punish it, you send it off into the swine. Um, that
Mhm.
is not Jesus's approach to people. And so I'm not saying that any of this is easy. I'm just saying that as conservative politics catches up to the more progressive vocabulary, we have to be careful that if you're a Christian and you're politically conservative on this, that you don't start using conservative politics to think about your Christian language and the way in which you think about the value of the life of other people, um, and the possibility of what it is that God might be working in their lives. And so that's the point where I can see I can understand the decisions and things people make and the language that they use, and the fears are real. There is real evil. There's real good and bad. All of that. I'm just saying that if my primary identity is in Christ, then
Mm.
there are certain elements of the things that I look at this distinguishing characteristic and say, fear cannot be my motivating factor. So, thing number 1, whatever kills you makes you weaker. Not true. But like you were talking with your son, we cannot listen to the 5 alarm fire bells every single day in every single area of life that's being continuously, like, IV injected into our brains,
Mm.
and live as Christians. We have to be able to be willing to sacrifice some of our comfort and our security in order to love well. It's just there. So this cultural trend number one that whatever doesn't kill you makes you weaker is not true. Jesus says, unless you lay down your life, take up your cross and follow me. Like, just let's call a spade here and say that that framework is incompatible with Christianity. And then to get to the second one, that always trust your feelings. Good luck trying to squeeze that one out of the New Testament. Um, it just doesn't fit there. And then the idea that the life is a battle between good and evil people also doesn't make sense of the incarnation and what Christ was up to. So I all I want to say here is that I think the
Well,
only
Christ,
modifications that I would make to this book, and I'll get you to finish this up. The only
yeah,
modifications that I would make to this book are that the categories have intensified. And not only have they intensified, but they've become normalized by everyone. And the true opportunity that we have as Christians is to be now. Okay, is it cancel culture if we don't invite certain people to speak in our churches? No, it just means we have a different vision and we're going forward there. Not every disagreement is canceling. Not platforming everybody is canceling. I think we have to be careful with overblowing the hype on all of that as well. As like, no, we just have a different vision and we're moving in a different direction. But it's very important for us to be the church that we're saying that the ethical principles that we learn from Christ and the overall story of good and evil and who controls that and who conquers it and who redeems and fixes it does not happen within our political discord. And we need to be very, very careful of using Christian language to justify our feelings on political topics.
this is perhaps too neat and tidy, but here it is anyway. To those who say, what doesn't kill me makes me weaker, Christ says, take up your cross. To those who say, trust your feelings, Christ says, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, turn the other cheek, consider others more important than yourself. And finally, to those who say life is a battle between good and evil people, well, Christ came to this world to redeem evil people. And I think Nathan's point is so important, that distinction between demons and human beings. Demons are no longer transformable. They're condemned. Human beings, we are, by God's grace, transformable. And part of what we are commanded to do as we go into the world and into our communities, make disciples of all people, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we do that not by coercing them or forcing them, but by talking with them, walking through life with them, and going through that process. And we aim at persuasion. And of course, we are not doing this on our own. If a heart turns, the heart is converted. It's the Holy Spirit at work. But again, we get to be a part in that process, which is amazing. But the point is, you can't do that if you're looking at people as the demonic other or the repugnant cultural other. You have to see them as human beings. And more importantly, you got to see them as a neighbor. And so it's quite a hurdle. There's a lot around us that tries to push us in the opposite direction. And that's why we got to work against it and cultivate Christian habits, which will force us to operate differently. Nathan, did you have something else to add there?
One last thing. So what we're saying in conclusion is that we think the book is accurate and it describes the pattern of our world. And we're saying as Christians, we're reminded not to be conformed by the pattern of this world. And so those two things happen at the same time. So let's look at it. Let's lament the things that are broken. Let's celebrate the things that are good. But let's not look at the pattern of the world for how we want to play the game or run well the race that the Lord has set out for us. Those would be my attempt at encouraging comments in reflection on the development of the ideas in this book.
You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.